We've spent a lot of time on Lacan's top two formulas of sexuation, the backwards capital E formulas that read, there does exist some one whose enjoyment eludes the phallic function, and in the other case, there does not exist anyone of this sort. And the one in question, you'll recall, is the figure and the function of an exceptional man whose unlimited, unconstrained, uncastrated enjoyment, so the argument goes for men, negates the phallic function, to which the rest of us poor slobs remain a little, to a lot, to entirely beholden. And here's what we discovered about this exceptional man. We discovered that he does not exist outside of masculine fantasies, which means two things. First, within the realm of masculine fantasy, there is always some one who qualifies as an exceptional, real man, at least more so than the masculine subject who sustains this fantasy. Here again is your real one, he a real one. Second, outside this fantasy, however, in the field of actuality, if we can talk about that, there is not one man of this sort. In fact, there are zero exceptional men outside of masculine fantasy. So we're going to sum this up. We might say the following. Masculine subjects wager that there's someone for whom the phallic function is inoperable. Feminine subjects show, however, that this someone is in fact a not one, N-A-U-G-H-T and N-O-U-G-H-T, one. In other words, a zero that only counts as one in masculine fantasy. Which again is why I offered the following bumper sticker. The exceptional man is not outside of masculine fantasy. The number one man that men fantasize about is not a being in the world, I'm suggesting, but the 0 point of whatever it means to be a man. What then does it mean to be a man? To be a man, a masculinized subject, regardless of one's anatomy, is to identify with, aspire to become, and often fiercely idolize men they perceive to be more manly than themselves. This much is clear, I think. But what about their intimate partners, be they girlfriends or boyfriends, wives or husbands, or any variation thereof? What about the masculine subject's intimate partner? If all men are governed by the phallic function, how exactly does this play out in their intimate lives? Not with fantastical figures of real men, but instead with actually existing others, all of whom are also, at least to some extent, governed by the phallic function. Now, as you can hear, we're edging towards Lacan's other two formulas of sexuation. One, again, for masculine subjects that reads, all of their enjoyment is phallic. And another, again, for feminized subjects that reads, not all of their enjoyment is phallic. So you can see these oppositions occurring between there does exist one who and there does not exist one who. All of their enjoyment is phallic, and now not all of their enjoyment is phallic. Important parallels there. Here's why all of this matters, I believe. Regardless of where you find yourself, the phallic function remains operative in your life, and especially apparent I would wager, in your intimate lives with others. Lovers, partners, friends, siblings, pets, the asshole in the car behind you, the list goes on. So let's ask, then, the central question in all of this, the question that runs through all 4 of Lacan's formulas of sexuation, the latest in what in this lecture is going to be just a string of questions. What is the phallic function, and how does it play out in everyday life? The phallic function, and with it the pursuit of phallic enjoyment, is an effect of castration, exactly as we've discussed it in lectures on Lacan, and right from the start. You start with society, and forgive me for this base review, but here it is. You begin with society, which brings with it a series of promoted behaviors and prohibited behaviors. And promotions plus prohibitions equals constraint, limitation, what Immanuel Kant, Lacan's great predecessor, called heteronomy, life lived on someone else's terms. To be born into a family, into a society, is to be born into a community where certain behaviors are promoted and others are prohibited. And the result of these prohibitions and promotions is a field of limited possible conduct, a field of constraint, limitation, where you can't just do whatever it is you want. This world is a world of heteronomy. It's the world of the symbolic, and the magic word for the state in which we encounter it and find ourselves therein is called castration. Repression, as you know, is part and parcel of this constrained, castrated life in society. And with repression comes the production of the unconscious, which in turn begets returns of the repressed, especially for our interest in the form of symptoms. Now, not all returns of the repressed are symptomatic expressions, but nevertheless, the symptom is a return of the repressed. So here it is, in a nutshell, and again, keeping it base. Society begets the unconscious begets the symptom. We've been over all this, so I'll just leave it at that. Recall, however, the formative functions of loss and lack in all of this. And now you can hear us backing up into even more basic Lacanian insights from earlier on in lectures on Lacan. Let's start with loss. The loss here in question is loss of access to imaginary objects, phi minus phi, resulting in experiences of lack that put us on the wheel of desire. Here's your Objectifying, from loss to lack. Loss, as we've discussed in this series, is an incision, a cut, an inscription. Lack, as an ensuing wound, opening, gap, or furrow, and desire becomes the urge to fill this lack, gap, or furrow with something, anything that approximates whatever it is we feel like we've lost. And what do we call this feeling we have when we've latched on to one of these supplements, one of these commodities, one of our objects of desire? That feeling is called surplus enjoyment, from the Proto-Indo-European root also of the word supplement, pele, meaning to fill. Question, yet another. Who are we in all of these desirous pursuits? Why, split subjects, of course, which is to say subjects in search of wholeness, completion, identity, and above all, here's that term with us now in Seminar 19, oneness. But let me be clear, and let me be as precise as I can be at this point. reading this text right alongside with you. I haven't read Seminar 19. I am still with you here in chapters 11 and 12. I have not read further in this text. And this is key. Not us reading together, that's wildly important, but being able to be more precise about what we mean by oneness. This is key. When I say that we as split subjects are beings in search of oneness, I don't mean that we are beings in search of union or fusion with others, at least not at root. More fundamentally, structurally, we are beings in search of autonomy, singularity, and as Lacan would put it, monadism. So you hear me shaping up castration around the Kantian notion of heteronomy, where the nomos of your life is determined by somebody other than yourself, heteronomy, versus the fantasy of oneness as autonomy, not fusion, but autonomy. Heteronomy, life lived on someone else's terms. Autonomy, where the nomos that governs your life is determined by the self, auto. We'll talk about that more, especially as this notion of monadism gets coupled with this logic of autonomy. Let's talk then about the burden this creates. The burden of split subjectivity, if you ask me, is less the experience of being split into multiple and often antagonistic selves than the subjugation of these selves to others. And what I mean by this is the following. If castration yields heteronomy, the desirous pursuit of surplus enjoyment promises to yield autonomy instead, promises to empower us to live not on someone else's terms, heteronomy, but instead on our own terms, autonomy. What then about this girlfriend, this boyfriend, this husband, this wife, this partner that we queued up at the start of things? What's up with the partner in all of this? The partner in this field of enjoyment, along this pole of enjoyment, as Lacan refers to it in Seminar 19, is just one more object of desire to be pursued, acquired, accumulated, consumed, and fucking instrumentalized for surplus enjoyment. The partner amounts to the part. This is the phallic function at work. Repeated reductions of partners to parts to be used, and unfortunately all too often abused, by split subjects desperate to feel whole. The partner becomes the part that the desperate subject uses and abuses in efforts to feel whole. And by whole, again, I want to reiterate, I mean autonomous. Not united with another, not fused with another, but autonomous. That's the wholeness, that's the oneness that we're talking about here. Autonomous, just like the father of the primal horde. You see? Autonomous, just like the exceptional man, whose exceptionality is nowhere more important than in his, nowhere more apparent, or more important for that matter, than in his power to play by his own rules, enjoying without limit, without constraint, without castration, in other words, with indisputable autonomy. That's the fantasy figure in question. To illustrate this way of being with others, with partners ever reduced to and reified as parts, here's what I suggest you do. It's simple. You need paper and pen. Take your paper and draw a circle on it. Then draw another circle overlapping just a bit with the one you just drew. Two circles side by side with an intersectional zone where they overlap. Two Euler circles, as you often see in Lacanian scholarship. In the left-hand circle, you can just write self. Or if you want to be a fancy Lacanian, you can put an S with a slash through it for the barred subject. In the right-hand circle, you can write other. Or again, if you want to be a fancy Lacanian, put an A in there. And I would recommend a capital A. And then in this intersectional zone where your two circles overlap, you can just write object. Self, object, other. Or if you're a fancy Lacanian, you can write a little italicized A as objet. You've probably seen a circle configuration like this before. Here's the key part, though, in illustrating how the phallic function in pursuit of phallic enjoyment unfolds relative to one's partner turned part. Put a big, fat X over the right-hand circle, marking out the other that you wrote in there, the big A, crossed out. What do you have left? What's left is a closed, hermetic circle in which parts of one's partner are used to make oneself feel whole, which is to say, autonomous. And if you were the fancy Lacanian who wrote in the algebraic symbols, you now also have the rudimentary structure for neurotic fantasy. Barred subject, lozenge, little a. That's what's left, is a partial circle pretending to be whole by latching onto the parts of their partner that they believe allow them to stand autonomously. But what about this partner? What about this other? In the other circle, the one with the big fat X over it, the partner is now split between desirous and dejected, present and absent aspects of selfhood. Relative to the first subject, this one is not all there. Relative to the self that reified, consumed, and accumulated their parts, this other self, this partner, they are not all there. They only appear in part, and only insofar as their parts lend themselves to someone else's enjoyment, at the level of felt wholeness, completion, and above all else, self-sufficiency. But this doesn't mean that the partner doesn't exist. The partner fucking remains, but in a divided, multiple state. The very state of split subjectivity from which their objectification, their reification, their commodification, their compartmentalization allowed someone else to feel removed and autonomous as a result, or at least to tell themselves that. Now, in keeping with this three-part Euler diagram, a left-hand circle, a crossed-out right-hand circle, and then this intersectional zone in between, we might say that the phallic function props up three modes of enjoyment. One based on having, another based on being, and another based on what I would just call something else. The first two modes of enjoyment, where one partner seeks to possess a part of another, and the other partner allows themselves to become this for them, these two modes of enjoyment, having and being, are both phallic. And in heteronormative intimate life, these two modes of phallic enjoyment are typically gendered. To be raised as a masculine subject is to be taught that you're nothing unless you have exclusive access to somebody else's parts. And you can imagine, to be raised as a feminine subject is to be taught that you're nothing but a pile of body parts to be had and held. to have and to hold until blah, 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 had and held by possessive masculine partners. Let me be clear. Women are taught to be what men are taught to have. Thankfully, there's always more to the feminized partner than the parts of her that lend themselves to desirous masculine consumption. Beyond the parts of her that men use to feel whole, note, by the way, these are the parts of her that he uses to plug his hole. Don't forget that. Beyond this, there's something else, something more, something which proves that not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function, the phallic function that polarizes enjoyment into logics and entire lifestyles of being and having. How are we to understand this extra phallic enjoyment? And I don't mean that it's like really, really phallic. I mean that in a way it's beyond phallic enjoyment. It is an other enjoyment relative to the phallic kind. It's what Lacan calls jouissance in Seminar 19. How are we to understand this? What's it all about? And crucially, how can we take steps in its direction, offsetting the either or of masculine subjectivity, in which you're either the master or just another slave? How to offset that with the both and of feminine subjectivity, in which not all of your enjoyment is governed by phallic logics of lordship and bondage. The clearest, most coherent, and I believe readily accessible answer to this question is the one Lacan has been providing since Seminar 17, with his theory and technique taking a distinctly discursive turn. From masters to hysterics to something else, something beyond, and all by way of analytic discourse. This, I believe, is the path before us, at the end of which, I'd wager, is a way of being in the world. Here's what's at stake, my friends, with selves and others alike, that is not entirely governed by the phallic function, in which not all of our enjoyment turns on logics of being and having. That's what's at stake in all of this. Even so, let me say one more word, at the risk of putting too fine a point on this stake, and yet still not saying enough about it. I'd like to suggest that it consists of 4 basic stages, this development in the direction of a not all. Each of these 4 stages is clinical and conceptual. Let's start at the beginning, where Lacan begins in Seminar 17 with the master, with that other side of psychoanalysis. Stage 1, mastery. Before the neurotic subject enters analysis, male or female, straight or gay, bi, trans, you name it, they often find themselves mired in the master's discourse. You want to know what's on the other side of phallic enjoyment? Start here. Figure out how masters operate. It's the first of 4 stages in that direction. More often than not, this is where we, dear neurotics, find ourselves. What does this entwinement with the master's discourse entail? Well, if you're used to playing master, it means ignorance is your mode of existence. Think back to our series on Seminar 17, where ignorance is such a prominent feature of the discourse of the master. 3 types of ignorance that I would cue up in the spirit of lists. First, the master is ignorant of their own castration, the very truth that props up their outspoken claims of authority and autonomy. Now, you heard that slip from prop to pop. That's exactly what castration does, nevertheless. It props up the semblance of agency that the master performs and keeps popping up in spite of this semblance of agency. It's not the only form of ignorance that characterizes masters, as you know. There's another one. If you're a master, you're ignorant of how things work because you only care that things work and that others keep things working for you. In other words, for your enjoyment. And so now here you have the two sides of the discourse of the master. When you draw this thing out, you've got your S1 addressing your S2, producing objet A, and then underneath that S1, you've got the barred subject. You've seen it 100 times before. Write it down one more time if you want to take a look at this. On the left-hand side of that discourse, that topology, you see the barred subject, castration, being the truth that props up atop which the master sits when they perform a semblance of authority, here S1. There's the left-hand side of that discourse. Now what I'm talking about is the right-hand side, when the master remains ignorant of how things work. That knowledge is instead possessed by the slave. The master cares only that things work and that they keep working, and always for their enjoyment, for their surplus enjoyment, at the level of the productions that are yielded from that knowledge of how things work. There's the right-hand side of the discourse of the master, with S2 pointing to objet A. We've been over this. I won't spend too much more time on it. Let me just add one more bit of ignorance for the master. Masters are also fundamentally ignorant of their own desire. The basic fantasy in which their identity finds its truest expression. And you can see it at the bottom part of the discourse of the master. That barred subject on the left, and then on the right, you've got objet A. What's in between? Nothing's in between. There is no vector, there is no arrow, there is no causal connection there, at least not a direct one. Instead, you see a delta of impotence. You see an incapacity to realize the connection between the barred subjectivity that is the truth of the master and that little objet A as product of surplus work and for surplus enjoyment that gets the master off. You put those two together, and once again, you've got the basic structure of fantasy, a barred subject in relation to objet A. The master is fundamentally ignorant that this is their fantasy. This fantasy, though, and you can see the master's ignorance coursing all throughout their discourse, culminating in this ignorance of the very fantasy on which they depend, is wildly phallic. In order for the master to feel whole, complete, singular, one, autonomous, in other words, that S1, instead of fragmented, incomplete, multiple, divided, and heteronomous, there's that barred S, they objectify and exploit others. There's your S2, compelling them to instrumentalize their knowledge and themselves for the production of widgets, wobbles, consumables, in short, commodities for the master's enjoyment. You know what we call these things? Parts. Parts which, when possessed by the master, allows him or her to feel whole, complete, singular, one, and autonomous. That's how we read the discourse of the master in this case. I believe there are two types of enjoyment at work here. In addition to the phallic enjoyment of objectified and exploited others that you see in the upper right-hand corner of the discourse of the master, as you know, also experiences surplus enjoyment at the level of these exploited others' work. Here is the lower right-hand quadrant of the discourse of the master. So you have, again, what Lacan calls a pole of jouissance on the right side of any given discourse. Phallic enjoyment at the top, surplus enjoyment at the bottom. And here you can see how they work together. Phallic enjoyment at the top shows a willingness to objectify, commodify, and exploit others, especially at the level of their knowledge. And surplus enjoyment in the lower right shows a desire to commodify, consume, possess whatever is produced by that knowledge, and always experienced as a kind of surplus enjoyment. So, for example, stick with the heteronormative, sometimes it's easier for a minute. Oh, dear wifey. Now, that doesn't mean this is a straight relationship. I know lots of people that play wife. That ain't nothing of the sort. Wifey is not just reduced to his or her knowledge of cooking, notably one part of their multifaceted existence. Wifey is also instrumentalized in this example for the production of home-cooked meals for hubby's consumption, meals which allow him, her, the hubby, to feel whole, full, complete. You get where we're going with this. We can go on listing examples, but I think that one's clear enough. This is in part what Lacan is up to in Chapter 5 of Seminar 19, when he redraws his topology of discourse, and again relabels that right side the pole of jouissance. Here it is. In the master's relation to the other, we see phallic jouissance. And in the master's relation to the other's productions, again, we see surplus jouissance. It's really important to get this pole of jouissance sorted out, because all too often we think that phallic and surplus jouissance are the same thing. They're not. They work well together, all too well, unfortunately. But I don't want to spend any more time with that. We got 4 stages that we want to go through. Let's get on to the second one. The second stage here, I'm just going to call it analysis. First stage is mastery. The second stage is analysis. In analysis, the fantasy of which the master is ignorant, even and especially the more he lives by it, is on full display. That's what you see in the top part of the discourse of the analyst. The barred subject and that little a that the master can't connect at the level of fantasy is connected in the top of the discourse of the analyst, albeit in a rather perverse way, if you recall our lectures on this topic. This is not just about the master's fantasy, though. It is also more precisely about the truth of the master's subjectivity. Not the fantasy of autonomy and omnipotence, but the fact of heteronomy and impotence, namely castration. The discourse of the analyst puts the castration that the master cannot bear directly on the firing line. This castrated, barred subjectivity becomes the addressee, becomes in many ways the one who speaks in the discourse of the analyst. The analysand speaks and the analyst listens. For what? The analyst listens for the master's unconscious truth when it finds expression in symptomatic expressions of the lacking subject that these motherfuckers truly are. Nothing new there, but it does help us further illustrate this pole of enjoyment, as Lacan calls it, in the right-hand side of things. Here, the pole of jouissance in the discourse of the analyst, as Lacan calls this right side of his discursive quadrant, it is one of speech at this point. In the discourse of the analyst, the pole of jouissance is one of speech. The analysand is one chatty motherfucker. And in chatty motherfuckering, I don't mean to suggest that they are full of fluent, empty speech. That's not what the analyst is listening for. It's not the fluent, empty speech of the master with all of their S1s swarming. No, what's happening there, the speech that is of interest in the analytic discourse is the disfluent, full and symptomatic speech of the master's split subjectivity, which is to say, again, their castration. To account for this causal sequence, from unconscious truths to barred subjectivities to symptomatic expressions, you know what Lacan does. He introduces a fifth vector in his topology of discourse in Seminar 19. You can check it out. Again, chapter 5 of Seminar 19, notably, if I'm not mistaken, page 53 in the English translation. And you can, of course, recall our earlier lecture and discussion of this topic when we were reading chapters 5 and 6. We're now into 11 and 12, but the materials are still there, just a couple lectures back from this one. When Lacan adds a vector from the position of truth to that of the other, or the addressee, this is that fifth vector that he adds. I told you he's making two basic moves when he adds this vector from the lower left-hand quadrant of discourse up to the upper right-hand quadrant of discourse. First, at the level of the math theme, he's further highlighting the wide-open, irreducible gap of impotentiality between truth and product, cause and effect in any given discourse. So he's adding vectors, but one place he's not going to add a vector is in the bottom part of discourse. Between truth and product, cause and effect in any given discourse, there is no connecting vector. That's part of what the addition of the fifth vector highlights. For example, before analysis, the master, as you know, is powerless to see that the others and the productions that they enjoy, at the level of a meal, a body part, a pile of money, whatever, they are all conditioned for enjoyment by a truth which the master cannot bear to admit. And it's the same truth which also conditions his outspoken claims of mastery. Barred, lacking, and desirous subjectivity. That is the truth of the master's discourse. In analysis, however, it is precisely this truth that's allowed and encouraged to speak. The truth of barred subjectivity that the master cannot bear is allowed and encouraged to speak in its other side, the discourse of the analyst, which is also what the addition of the fifth vector is designed to show, you've heard me say. The unconscious truth of castration atop which the master sits is also that which commands his barred subjectivity to speak in analysis. And not just any old way, but in symptoms. This is what the fifth vector on page 53 of Seminar 19, when plugged into the discourse of the analyst, shows. You get a sequence from S2 as unconscious truth to barred subject, and then from barred subject down to S1 as symptomatic expression. This is that circuit that the fifth vector allows for. And you know where we went with that circuit from S2 to barred subject to S1, then resulting in the classic Lacanian arrow, from surplus enjoyment in any given discourse up to the agent in that discourse, S1 feeding back into the position of the analyst. We've been through all that. There's something new here, which is the reason why I'm queuing it up again. Because when last we discussed this sequence in our lecture on chapter 5, it was all about how this circuit from symptomatic expressions feed back into the analyst's knowledge of how the unconscious works. You see, and that's what it amounted to, was the fifth vector allows Lacan to suggest that the analyst sits atop knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, but that this knowledge is always being mediated through, shot through, adjusted, and revised alongside symptomatic expressions. The analyst has a sense of how the unconscious works, and this sense is constantly being amended, updated with every clinical experience, with every symptomatic expression. And that's why you see those two arrows feeding into the position of the analyst. The unconscious truth of the analysand, when it pops through the subject into the symptom, becomes a resource to add to the analyst's understanding of how the unconscious works. Again, there are always two definitions of that S2 in the lower left-hand quadrant of the discourse of the analyst. Here, however, in our reading of chapters 11 and 12 of Seminar 19, I want to stick with this S1, this symptomatic expression positioned as the product of the analytic discourse. And I want to show how it marks the other side of the S1 in the discourse of the master. You see, there's an S1 in the discourse of the master. You know where that goes. There's an S1 in the discourse of the analyst, and you know where that goes. These two S1s are each other's other side. The reason why I want to do this and focus on this S1 again is because I think this is ultimately what Lacan is doing with the one in these middle chapters of Seminar 19. He is fundamentally talking about S1, two different types of S1, the S1 of the master and the S1 of the hystericized analysand in the analytic discourse. So look at the master's discourse, find that S1. That's one of the ones that Lacan is talking about here. Take a look then at the analyst discourse. Find the S1. This is another S1 that Lacan is using oneness to discuss in these middle chapters of Seminar 19. Let's start then right here on this topic because we are in Seminar 19. Seminar 17, you can go check it out. We're reading 19 right now. Let's start with the master's oneness. Because I think his oneness, the master's oneness, the S1 in the discourse of the master, it's the easiest one to account for. So let's just knock it out. To Lacan's there is oneness, the master always adds, and I am it. You want it in a nutshell? That's it in a nutshell. There is oneness, and the master is the motherfucker in the room who stands up and says, and I am it. In order for the master to be one, the one all alone, autonomous, singular, without constraint or limitation, remember what we're talking about here, as the living exception that proves his rule over everyone else, the master has to remain ignorant of all that conditions and compels his claims of oneness, authority, autonomy, and the like. Here's that master's ignorance popping up again. His, the master's, is a count that begins with one. His one, above, beyond, and before which there is no other. That's what it means to put S1 in the position of the agent in the discourse of the master. But this S1 only works insofar as every other one, everyone else, including the master's true self, as a subject of lack like the rest of us, remains suppressed. And as Lacan puts it at the end of chapter 12 of Seminar 19, inaccessible. It's a terrific use of the term, and he repeats it multiple times at the end of chapter 12. This part of self, like everyone else, for the master remains somehow inaccessible. Inaccessible, except, of course, as subsequent integers in the count inaugurated by the master's singular, autonomous, sui generis one. They can follow his lead, but they cannot precede it. He's the number one, you're the number two, I'm the number three, and so on and so forth. We can follow the master's lead, but we can't precede it. That is the master's gambit. And that's just it, my friends. The count of the master is as simple and as diluted as that of 1, 2, 3, and so on. That is the master's count. Congratulations, masters, you can count to 3. But from set theory to symbolic logic, Cantor to Frege, we've learned something else. We have learned that oneness of this sort at the start of a naive count 1, 2, 3 is an effect. It's a production. It's a naive numerical result of a far more sophisticated mathematical logic. That's why Lacan keeps queuing up set theory and symbolic logic, with recourse to Cantor and Frege, because he wants to remind us again and again what we've learned in modern mathematical theory and symbolic logic as a result, that oneness is an effect. It's a production. The resources and opportunities and conditions of which remain inaccessible to all who insist that their one is the first one. This mathematical logic is one that I believe dovetails nicely with Lacanian theory and technique, because once again, it's always just been about ones and zeros. Lacan being above all else, not a psychoanalytic theorist, but a digital theorist. Recall, for instance, the basic math of symbolic alienation, the paternal function, castrative logic, all the other terms we have for this. And just as we've been discussing it in this series, lectures on Lacan, right from the start, the math is simple. 1 minus 1 equals 0. Or, if you want to be fancy Lacanian about it, phi minus phi equals Obj-A. You know all this backwards and forwards, so I won't spend too much time with it. But take an example, easy. From the breast, 1. To its loss during weaning, -1. To the experience of lack figured in the gape of the mouth, 0. 1 minus 1 equals 0. We could also, however, be more technical, and in this case, for purposes of clarity. The first one in this 1 minus 1 equals 0 is the imaginary object, the imaginary phallus. Whatever we imagine the maternal figure, your maternal figure, then and now, to want in addition to us. We've been over this again, moving fast. What then of the second one? The 1 minus 1. What of this -1? The second one, the one with the minus sign before it, here is the figure of loss. The loss of this imaginary object by way of the no of the father, the paternal function. And as Lacan reminds us in chapter 12 of Seminar 19, the unary trait. There is another one for us to consider. The unary trait is a -1. It's the -1 in phi minus phi equals 0. 1 minus 1 equals 0. It's the -1 that initiates the castrative logic. That is the unary trait, qua incision, cut, and again, inscription. Why do I say this? Why am I repeating the word inscription here? To capture the experience of loss that inaugurates the castrative logic. I say inscription because this is the first mark of subjectivity that society leaves on the living individual. You want to know where subjectivity begins for Lacan? This is where it begins for Lacan, with the unary trait, a singular stroke, the first mark of subjectivity, the first cut, the furrow, the slice, the incision, the inscription that society leaves in the living individual. Between the mark of subjectivity and the locus of living individualism in which it's left, there is an irreducible gap, a furrow, an opening. Here is your Obj-A, qua lack. Or as Lacan puts it on page 156 of Seminar 19, the mark of lack. What emerges from this lack, and never as anything more than its vessel, that's important, as its container, the container of this lack, the vessel in which this lack is contained. That is the barred subject. The barred subject is the vessel of lack. This is the subject of desire. This is the Lacanian subject, qua neurotic. This is the S with a slash through it. This is our barred subject, a vessel of lack. And this, of course, is where our math, dear Lacanians, gets a bit fuzzy, and I believe in the best possible way. Another mathematical equation for you, fuzzier than the first. 1 plus 1 equals 3. You've heard it before. Let's do it again. 1 plus 1 equals 3. The enunciating subject in all of their bioanimality, the body, plus the grammatical subject in all of their sociolinguistifications at the level of representation. So you have the enunciating subject plus the grammatical subject, 1 plus 1. The reason why 1 plus 1 equals 3 here, however, is because there is an unavoidably differential relation between enunciating and grammatical subjects, according to Lacan. Here, an unavoidably differential relation symbolized by the ever-present 0 point of human existence, which, as you know, is object little a. From Seminar 10 forward, Lacan's pretty clear about this Objectifying being the 0 point for things. It marks the 0 point the same way that the number 0 tells you where lack is. Why in the hell am I rehearsing all this here? Hot damn, you've been over this material so much. Why are we back at it again? Why am I rehearsing this basic and fuzzy math for us in a lecture founded on a seminar that seems so far removed from these basic Lacanian mathematics? Because I believe this is precisely what Lacan is using set theory, particularly the empty set, to develop anew. Consider, for instance, the mathematical logic he presents at the end of chapter 12 on page 54, the chapter that we just finished reading and on which this lecture is centered. You've seen this bizarre and basic mathematical logic at the bottom of page 154. In parentheses, you have a 0 pointing to a 1. And then the parentheses has an arrow pointing from it to the number 1. So you have a 0 pointing to a 1 in parentheses, and then the entire parentheses is pointing to the number 1. You can see it at the bottom of page 154, right at the end of chapter 12, Seminar 19. Let's take these numbers one at a time and make our math a little fuzzier still. The 0 here that points to 1 in parentheses is the very same as that which castration produces by way of loss and lack, minus phi giving way to Objectifying. That's the 0 in this formula on page 154. The key word here, I believe, is lack. And I'm not just making that shit up because that's what Lacanians say. The key word here is lack because it's all over these chapters in Seminar 19. Lacan himself is making this about lack. It's this lack that gets him thinking, I believe, about the empty set. And all in order to illustrate, hear me now, the position and the posture of the unconscious, which, as we know, is precisely what makes it real. But by the time we're done with this shit, we're going to start introducing a distinction between the unconscious and the real. Hold that in mind, even as I tell you right now that the unconscious is indeed real. With the number 0, in this 0 pointing to 1 in parentheses next to an arrow pointing to another 1. With this 0 pointing to 1 in parentheses, Lacan is attempting to show his audience that oneness of every type, and there are several types again at work here, finds its original grounding, as he puts it, in lack. You can check it. It's on page 126. Namely, at the level at which there is one missing, Lacan says, in the field and the function, nay, let's call it what it is, a discourse of what Lacan calls the one that is not there. It's on page 134 of the English translation of Seminar 19. You can check it out. And because this is a one that is not there, we can say it is real. As ever, though, I want to suggest that Lacan has his sights set on analytic experience. Check out, for instance, page 134. We haven't dipped into the book other than to call some things out. It's time to actually get our feet wet. Page 134 gives us a terrific passage to account for what we've been discussing, this zero, this one that is not there. Check it out, page 134, middle of the page. The one that is not there for the analyst is the real. This jouissance, the jouissance that is not in analysis, if you will allow me to put it like this, holds the function of the real for the analyst. On the other hand, what is in analysis, that is to say, the subject, the analyst takes for what it is, namely, for an effect of discourse. I ask you to note, in passing, that he doesn't subjectify this. This doesn't mean that all this is his own little idea, but rather that as a subject, he is determined by, check it out, a discourse from which he has long originated, and this is what is analyzable. I will specify that the analyst is on no account a nominalist. He does not think of his subject's representations. Rather, he has to intervene in his discourse by procuring for him an additional signifier. This is what is called interpretation. And now for us, we get the important part at the end. When it comes to what is not within his reach, this one that is not there, which is what is in question here, namely the jouissance of the one who is not there in analysis, he takes it for what it is, that is, an order of the real, because he can do nothing about it. By way of conclusion to the first part of this lecture on chapters 11 and 12 of Seminar 19, I want to ask, what is this jouissance that is not in analysis, from which the analysand, as a barred subject, a lacking subject, has long originated? In the spirit of rehearsal, I think you know exactly what this jouissance that is not in analysis is. It's sexual jouissance. It's impossible jouissance. It's unconscious jouissance. It's real jouissance. Zero, a circle with a slash through it, here written as the mathematical symbol of the empty set, is the number we use to mark the place as well as the operational logic of a one that is not there. That's what zero does for Lacan, the same way that objet A marks one that is not there. So, when you subtract one from itself, guess what? One is no longer there. 1 minus 1 is a way of talking about how 1 is no longer there. And yet, we can still mark its absence. 1 minus 1 equals 0. Phi minus phi equals objet A. That's enough rehearsing to put us on the path of what's truly at stake in these chapters toward the end, or at least close enough, in Seminar 19.